The case of Tomás Ramírez began as an act of paternal discipline. That's how his stepfather justified it for years. But what was discovered in that room on Commerce Street in Piedras Negras revealed something far darker than simple punishment. 10 years. 120 months. More than 3,600 days. A 6-year-old boy chained to a wooden pillar in perpetual darkness. No light, no space to walk, no childhood. Because that house was not a home. It was a prison. And the executioner slept every night in the room next door. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing and silenced cases in the history of Coahuila. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time right now. We're deeply interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented stories that time tried to erase reach. The world of 1874. It was the year 1874. Mexico was barely breathing after decades of instability. Sebastián Lerdo de Tejada occupied the presidency in a country trying to rebuild itself after the French intervention and the execution of Maximilian. The republic had been restored, but the wounds remained open. The north of the country, especially Coahuila, lived in constant tension between the colonial tradition that still persisted and the liberal ideas that were trying to break through. Piedras Negras was then a border city of just over 4,000 inhabitants. Separated from Eagle Pass, Texas, only by the Rio Bravo, the city was a meeting point between two worlds, the conservative and Catholic Mexico of the interior and the commercial pragmatism that came with proximity to the United States. The dirt streets turned into muddy swamps when the rains came. The constructions, mostly of adobe and stone, extended from the river bank toward the interior in an irregular pattern. The smell of cattle and tanned leather dominated the atmosphere, mixing with the dust that the northern wind constantly lifted. The main plaza was the heart of social life. The church of Nuestra Señora de San Juan, with its modest bell tower, marked the rhythm of the days with its calls to mass. Around it were grouped the municipal palace, some grocery stores, a cantina frequented by ranchers and merchants, and the houses of the wealthiest families. But just 4 blocks from that seemingly civilized center, on Commerce Street number 32, a horror was taking shape that the society of Piedras Negras would prefer to ignore for an entire decade. In that era, paternal authority was practically absolute. The civil code recognized the father as the undisputed head of the family, with the right to moderately correct and punish his children. But the word moderately was interpreted in very different ways. Corporal punishment was not only permitted but was considered necessary for character formation. Few dared to question what happened behind closed doors, especially if the man of the house was known and respected. The boy with honey-colored eyes. Tomás Ramírez Soto was born in the spring of 1868. He was the second child of Maria Soto, a petite 23-year-old woman who had been widowed barely a year after marriage. Her first husband, Juan Ramírez, had died in an accident while working on the bridge construction over the river. Maria was left alone with 2 small children, Isabel, 4 years old, and Tomás, who had just turned 6 months. Neighbors remembered Tomás as a child with easy laughter. He had dark, curly hair like his mother and honey-colored eyes he had inherited from his father. A small crescent-shaped birthmark decorated his left cheek, a detail that would later prove crucial for his identification. He liked to chase chickens in the backyard of the house they rented on Hidalgo Street and had the habit of talking to animals as if they could understand him. His sister Isabel would recount years later that Tomás was afraid of the dark and that every night he asked them to leave a candle burning in his room. Maria's life as a young widow was not easy. She sewed clothes for some wealthy families in the city, a job that barely covered rent and food. The social pressure on a single woman was immense. The whispered comments, the disapproving looks at mass, the constant feeling of vulnerability. When Esteban Carranza began courting her in the winter of 1873, Maria saw in him an opportunity for stability for her children. The wolf in sheep's clothing. Esteban Carranza was 35 years old and known in Piedras Negras as a hardworking and serious man. He owned a small tannery on the outskirts of town, a business that gave him enough income to maintain a 2-room adobe house on Commerce Street. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache and hands calloused from working with hides, he attended Mass every Sunday, greeted his neighbors courteously, and paid his debts on time. No one would have suspected what was hidden behind that facade of respectability. The wedding was celebrated in April 1874. A simple ceremony at San Juan Church with barely a dozen guests. Maria wore a dark gray dress, not white as befitted her second marriage. Tomás, just turned 6, wore a suit that was too big for him, borrowed from a neighbor's son. Isabel, 9, held her brother's hand throughout the entire ceremony. The parish priest, Father Ignacio Medina, would bless that union with words about conjugal duties and obedience. No one imagined that this newly formed family was about to become the setting for one of the darkest stories Coahuila would ever know. The move to Commerce Street. The move to the house on Commerce Street occurred 2 days after the wedding. It was an adobe construction larger than where they had lived before, with whitewashed walls that reflected the midday sun. It had 3 rooms, the main one where Esteban and Maria would sleep, a smaller one for Isabel, and a room at the back of the house that Esteban designated as storage. The windows were small, as was customary to keep the warmth in winter and the cool in summer. The floor was of packed earth, covered with palm mats. A side corridor connected the rooms with a backyard where Esteban kept some tools from his tannery and where there was a water well. The first days passed with a deceptive normality. Maria took care of the household chores. Isabel helped with cleaning and took care of her younger brother. And Tomás explored every corner of his new home with the natural curiosity of a 6-year-old child. But Esteban began to show signs of what was to come. Small rules that at first seemed reasonable. The children should not speak during meals unless asked something. They should not make noise when he rested after work. They should ask permission to go out to the patio. Maria, accustomed to the freedom of raising her children alone, began to feel the tension, but she convinced herself that it was just a matter of adaptation. The first punishment. The first severe punishment came barely 2 weeks after the move. On a Sunday afternoon, April 28, 1874, Tomás had spilled water on the floor of the master bedroom while trying to help carry a pitcher. It was a simple accident of the kind any child could commit, but Esteban reacted with disproportionate fury. He grabbed him by the arm with such force that it left purple marks and locked him in the back room without food until the next day. Maria tried to intercede, but Esteban silenced her with a look that admitted no reply. That night, neighbors in the adjoining house heard a child's crying that lasted until dawn, but no one knocked on the door because in those times, the discipline of children was a private matter. The punishments became more frequent. A misspoken word. A plate not picked up quickly enough. A look that Esteban interpreted as defiant. Tomás spent increasingly more time locked in that room at the back of the house. Maria tried to compensate with affection when Esteban wasn't there, but the fear was also beginning to paralyze her ability to protect her son. The day that changed everything. And then came the day that would change everything. It was June 23, 1874, a Tuesday. The summer heat turned the streets of Piedras Negras into ovens of dust. Esteban had returned early from the tannery, in a bad mood after an argument with a client who refused to pay what was agreed. He found Tomás playing in the patio with some sticks, imagining they were horses. The boy had forgotten to put away a bucket of water that Esteban had ordered him to store that morning. What happened next was partially witnessed by Isabel, who watched from the door of her room. Esteban grabbed Tomás by the arm and dragged him toward the back room. The boy tried to apologize, his high voice breaking in tears. Maria ran out of the kitchen when she heard the screams, but she arrived too late. The room door slammed shut. The unmistakable sound of a bolt sliding was heard, and then something more, the metallic pounding of chains. When Maria tried to open the door, Esteban came out blocking her way. His words were clear and threatening. Listen, Maria, the boy needs to learn respect. He won't come out until he's reflected on his behavior. And if you try to get him out, you leave this house with nothing. Maria, a woman of barely 29 years, with 2 children and no means to support herself, was paralyzed by that threat. She thought it would be just a day, maybe 2. She convinced herself that Esteban would come to his senses. But what she didn't know, what no one could imagine, was that Tuesday, June 23, 1874, would mark the beginning of 10 years of hell for little Tomás. The prison cell. The room where Esteban locked the boy measured approximately 3 meters wide by 4 meters long. It had no windows. The only source of light was what filtered through the cracks in the wooden door when someone lit a candle in the corridor. The adobe walls, without whitewash, gave off a damp, earthy smell. The floor was compacted dirt, cold in winter and suffocating in summer. In the center of the room, Esteban had driven a mesquite wood pillar, as thick as an adult man's arm, which sank more than half a meter into the ground. To that pillar, with an iron chain normally used to tie cattle, Esteban chained Tomás. The chain was approximately 2 meters long, enough for the boy to sit, lie down, or stand, but not to reach the door or the more distant walls. The metal shackle surrounded his right ankle. At first, the little one cried constantly, calling his mother with a voice that broke into sobs. Then he began to beg Esteban to let him out. He promised to behave well. He promised to do everything they ordered. He promised never to make any mistake again. But the door remained closed. The first night passed, then the first day, the first week. Maria managed to bring him food when Esteban left for work. Cold tortillas, some beans, water in a clay jug. She would enter the room with a candle trembling in her hands and find her son sitting in the darkness, with reddened eyes and dirty clothes. The boy's ankle began to fill with sores from the constant rubbing of the metal. Maria tried to wash them with clean water, but the chain was never removed. The mother's failed attempt. When the first month was completed, Maria gathered courage to confront Esteban. "He's learned his lesson," she said. "Let him out." Esteban's response was a blow that threw her to the floor. "As long as I am the man of this house, I decide when he has learned." And then he added something that would freeze anyone's blood. "The boy has a demon inside. I see it in his eyes. He won't come out until that demon is completely expelled." The neighbors began to notice Tomás's absence. A woman named Dolores Mendez, who lived in the adjoining house, asked Maria about the boy one day. "I sent him to my sister's ranch," Maria lied. "The country air will do him good." It was a common excuse in that era. Children were often sent to live with relatives in rural areas to help with farm work. No one questioned that explanation too much. The descent into darkness. Months passed. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to Tomás's first winter of captivity. The unheated room became a frozen chamber during December nights. Maria managed to sneak in a blanket when she could, but Esteban discovered one of them and burned it in front of the boy. "Comfort doesn't teach discipline," he said while watching the flames consume the fabric. The boy's development began to alter in visible ways. At 7 years old, when other children ran and played, Tomás could barely walk the 2 meters his chain allowed. His legs began to weaken from lack of movement. His growth stopped. Language, which at that age should be flourishing, began to deteriorate. He spent entire days without speaking to anyone, except in the brief minutes when his mother managed to visit him. He began to develop a stutter that would never leave him. Isabel tried to visit him secretly when Esteban wasn't there. She told him stories in whispers through the door, trying to keep her brother's spirit alive. She told him about what was happening outside, the town festivals, the street vendors who passed by, the river that grew during rainy season. But with the passage of time, even Isabel began to normalize the situation. She was a girl of 12, 13, 14 years old, growing up in a home where horror had become routine. Maria's transformation. The changes in Maria were equally devastating. That woman who had been described as cheerful and hardworking transformed into a shadow. Her face lost color. She stopped fixing her hair with her previous care. Her hands, once skillful with the needle, began to tremble. She developed the habit of standing motionless in front of the door of the room where her son was locked up, as if by just being close she could protect him somehow. Neighbors saw her walking to the market with a lost look, murmuring prayers that no one could understand. Her relationship with Esteban became a permanent silence broken only by the orders he gave. They slept in the same room, but they were like strangers. Maria tried to be invisible, to walk without making noise, not to provoke any reaction that could result in more violence. The guilt consumed her. She knew she had to do something, but fear and lack of options paralyzed her. Where would she go with 2 children? Who would believe her if she told what was happening? What authority would take action when the law itself granted absolute power to the man over his family? She tried to speak with Father Ignacio Medina in confession. She told him, without giving specific details, that her husband punished her son severely. The priest's response was predictable for that era. The man is head of the household. If he punishes the boy, it's because the boy deserves it. Your duty as a wife is to obey and pray that your husband finds moderation in his justice. Maria left the church with a feeling of emptiness in her chest. Not even God seemed to be on her son's side. Years of torment. The first year became 2, then 3. Tomás turned 9 years old, chained in the darkness. His body began to show the irreversible consequences of confinement. His spine curved slightly from forced postures. His skin, deprived of sunlight, became a sickly pale. He developed extreme photosensitivity. Even the dim light of a candle caused pain in his eyes. His mind also changed. He began to talk to himself, having conversations with imaginary voices. Sometimes he screamed for no apparent reason. Other times he spent days in absolute silence. The cheerful boy who chased chickens in the yard had disappeared. In his place remained something different. A growing human being who had never known freedom, who didn't remember how the sun felt on his skin, who didn't know what it meant to run. Esteban, for his part, seemed convinced of the righteousness of his actions. He justified the continued confinement with increasingly twisted reasons. The demon is resistant, he would say to Maria on the rare occasions when she dared to bring up the subject. But I will break it. I will break it even if it takes 20 years. And so the years passed. 1875, 1876, 1877, 1878. Tomás grew in that darkness, but it was a deformed growth. His legs, without use, atrophied. His arms remained thin and weak. His height barely increased. At 10 years old, he looked like a boy of 6 or 7. His mind adapted to confinement in ways that would horrify child psychology experts decades later. He forgot what the outside world looked like. He forgot faces except for his mother's and, vaguely, Isabel's. He forgot what food that wasn't stale tortillas or bean water tasted like. He forgot the sound of laughter, the feel of grass under bare feet, the warmth of the sun. What he didn't forget was the length of the chain, 2 meters, not 1 centimeter more. His entire universe was defined by that measure. The years continue. By 1880, Tomás had turned 12. But his body was that of an 8 or 9-year-old child. Maria had aged decades in those 6 years of continuous anguish. Isabel, now 16, had become a young woman trapped in a nightmare. She couldn't bring friends home. She couldn't talk about what was happening. The weight of the secret was crushing her. One day in late 1881, Isabel couldn't take it anymore. She packed her few belongings and left the house. She went to live with an aunt in Saltillo. Before leaving, she went to the back room and whispered through the door, "Forgive me, Tomás. I can't save you. I can't even save myself." Tomás, who by then rarely spoke even when his mother visited him, said nothing. Perhaps he no longer understood what forgiveness meant. The discovery. And then, in March 1882, after almost 8 years of captivity, something happened that would change everything. Esteban, who had prospered in his tanning business, hired a young worker named Rafael Ochoa, 22 years old, recently arrived in Piedras Negras looking for work. Rafael was a good worker, honest and curious. One day, while delivering a leather order to Esteban's house, he had lunch with the family. During the meal, Esteban, in a moment of inexplicable pride, made a comment that would seal his fate. "I don't know why Maria complains so much about the food I give the boy in the back room. It's more than he deserves." Rafael didn't understand immediately. He thought he was referring to a temporary punishment, something normal for those times. But then Esteban added, with that tone used by those convinced of their own moral righteousness, "He's been there 8 years and he won't come out until the demon leaves him." The silence that followed was absolute. Rafael stopped chewing. His eyes moved from Esteban to Maria, looking for some sign that this was a macabre joke, but he found only confirmation in the woman's devastated face. 8 years, he finally managed to articulate. 8 years, confirmed Esteban. Since he was 6. It's for his own good. Discipline forges character. Raphael finished the meal in a state of shock. He didn't dare say more, but when he left that house, his hands were trembling. The rescue. That same afternoon, Raphael went straight to find the justice of the peace of Piedras Negras, Don Emilio Sanchez Navarro. He found him in the main plaza talking with other men from the town. "Don Emilio," said Raphael, trying to control the urgency in his voice, "I need to speak with you. It's important." In the judge's office, a small room in the municipal palace, Raphael told what he had heard. Don Emilio, a 60-year-old man with a white mustache and a reputation for being fair but prudent, listened with initial skepticism. "It's a serious accusation," he said. "Are you sure of what you heard?" "He said it himself," insisted Raphael. 8 years. He has a child chained for 8 years. The judge was thoughtful. In that era, interfering in family matters was delicate. Parental authority was almost sacred. But 8 years. That exceeded any definition of moderate correction. "I need to verify it," he finally said. "I'll go tomorrow." But Raphael, impulsive and young, was not willing to wait. That same night, around 8 o'clock, he returned to the house on Commerce Street. He knocked on the door insistently. It was Maria who opened. Her reddened eyes showed that she had been crying. "I need to see the boy," said Raphael without preamble. "You can't," she whispered. "Esteban isn't here. But if he finds out—" "Ma'am," Raphael interrupted her. "I already told the judge. Tomorrow he'll come with the authorities. If there's something to see, they'll see it anyway. Better that I see it first." Maria hesitated. Then, perhaps seeing in this young man the possibility of salvation for her son, she nodded. She took a candle and guided him down the corridor toward the back room. What Raphael saw when Maria opened that door would haunt him for the rest of his life. The horror revealed. The smell was the first thing that hit him. A mixture of humidity, urine, and something else. The sweet smell of flesh that has never seen the sun. The candlelight barely penetrated the room's darkness. But it was enough. In the center, chained to the pillar, was a small figure huddled. At first, Raphael thought it was a boy of 8 or 9 years old. Then Maria whispered, "He's 14. The creature, because that's what it seemed like more than an adolescent, shrank before the candlelight. It raised a skeletal arm to cover its eyes. The skin was an unnatural pale. Hair that no one had cut in years fell tangled over its bony shoulders. It was naked except for a dirty piece of cloth that partially covered its body. The shackle on its right ankle was embedded in the skin, surrounded by scarred and suppurating tissue. The chain, rusted by the years, extended to the pillar. But the most disturbing thing was the eyes. When the boy finally lowered his arm and looked toward the light, Raphael saw in those eyes something he had never seen before. A total absence of hope. There was no fear, no sadness, not even curiosity. Just a deep emptiness. "Tomás," said Maria with a broken voice. "This gentleman is going to help you." The boy didn't respond. He kept staring at the candle as if it were the most fascinating thing he had seen in years. Perhaps it was. Raphael left the room containing his nausea. Maria closed the door behind him. "Why?" was all he could ask. "Because I was afraid," whispered Maria. "Because I had nowhere to go. Because no one would have believed me." "Why?" "Because I'm a coward. The authorities arrive." Raphael didn't sleep that night. First thing the next morning, March 23, 1882, he was back in Judge Sanchez Navarro's office. "I saw him," he said. "It's real, everything is real. You have to do something now." The judge, shocked by the young man's urgency, immediately gathered 4 men, the municipal sheriff Jose Maria Torres, the town doctor Dr. German Villarreal, Father Ignacio Medina, and Raphael as a witness. They arrived at Esteban Carranza's house around 10 in the morning. Esteban opened the door, surprised to see so many people. "Don Esteban," said the judge with a firm voice, We have received information that you are keeping a minor in inadequate conditions. I need to verify it. Esteban didn't deny anything. In fact, he maintained the same attitude of pride he had shown the day before. The boy is being corrected, he said. It's my right as a father to educate my stepson. I want to see the boy, insisted the judge. Esteban led them to the back room. He opened the door with the calm of one who doesn't believe he's committing any crime. Dr. Villarreal, a 45-year-old man who had seen much in his medical practice, paled at the scene. Father Medina crossed himself. Sheriff Torres involuntarily took a step back. Judge Sanchez Navarro remained motionless for several seconds. Then he said with a voice trembling with contained rage, "This is more than correction. This is torture. Don Esteban, you are under arrest." Esteban didn't understand. Arrested for disciplining my son? That is not your son, responded the judge. And even if he were, no law gives you the right to this. The medical examination. Dr. Villarreal slowly approached Tomás. The boy shrank against the pillar. I'm a doctor, Tomás, said the doctor with a soft voice. I'm going to examine you. I won't hurt you. Tomás didn't respond. Perhaps he no longer understood what those words meant. The initial examination revealed what would later be documented in the official medical report dated March 24, 1882. A minor of the male sex is presented of approximate age 14 years, according to maternal declaration, although his physical development corresponds to that of a child of 9 to 10 years. Height, 1 meter 42 centimeters. Estimated weight, 28 kilograms. Presence severe malnutrition, generalized muscle atrophy, spinal deformities from prolonged inadequate postures, lower extremities with little muscle mass and scarce mobility, right ankle with deep lesions, superimposed scars, signs of chronic infection, extremely pale skin with severe photosensitivity, fingernails and toenails grown without cutting for years. Mental state. The minor does not respond to direct questions. Shows signs of selective mutism or aphasia. Avoids eye contact. Presents constant tremors in upper extremities. Characteristic behavior of prolonged trauma is observed. Father Medina tried to speak with the boy. He asked him his name. He asked if he knew how to pray. He asked if he remembered ever being in church. Tomás looked at him without understanding. The words seemed to reach him as sounds without meaning. Then something happened that would break the hearts of all those present. Maria entered the room, knelt in front of her son, and began to cry. "Forgive me," she whispered over and over. "Forgive me, my son. Forgive me." Tomás looked at her, and for the first time in hours his face showed something. A vague recognition. He raised a trembling hand and extended it toward his mother. It was a simple, elemental gesture, but loaded with devastating meaning. In that movement was summarized everything he had lost: years of childhood, of growth, of maternal love that had been just a door away and yet unreachable. The liberation. Sheriff Torres had to use a hammer and chisel to break the shackle. The chain was so rusted that it broke with relative ease. But the metal ring around the ankle had to be removed carefully to not cause more damage. Tomás watched the process without expression. When the shackle finally fell to the floor with a metallic sound, the boy didn't move. "You're free now," Dr. Villarreal told him. "You can get up." But Tomás didn't get up. Not because he couldn't physically, although his legs were weak. He didn't get up because for 10 years the 2-meter length of that chain had defined the limits of his world. His mind didn't understand that he could now move beyond. It took several minutes of gentle persuasion for him to finally accept being carried out of the room. Dr. Villarreal wrapped him in a blanket and took him in his arms. He weighed so little it seemed like he wasn't carrying anything. When they took him out to the corridor, Tomás began to moan. The light entering through the windows, although it was a cloudy morning, was unbearable for his eyes, accustomed to absolute darkness. He covered his face with his hands and the moan turned into silent crying. Isabel watched from the door of her room. She was now 19 years old. She had grown up in that house of horror, hearing every night the sounds that came from that room, knowing her brother was suffering and feeling powerless to help him. When Tomás was carried past her, she tried to hug him, but he shrank from the contact. He no longer recognized affection. Human touch had become for him something associated only with pain and restriction. The arrest. Esteban Carranza was handcuffed and taken to the municipal jail. Throughout the arrest, he maintained the same expression of incomprehension and wounded pride. "I did what I had to do," he repeated. "I did what any responsible father would do. The boy had a demon. I saw it in his eyes." His words were recorded in Sheriff Torres's report. The accused shows no remorse for his actions. He insists that he was acting in fulfillment of his paternal duty. He considers that the prolonged confinement was a necessary disciplinary measure to expel what he describes as demonic influences in the minor. "In my assessment as an officer, the accused does not understand the gravity of his acts and represents a continuing danger." The beginning of recovery. Tomás was immediately taken to Dr. Villarreal's house, where a recovery space was improvised. The doctor knew the case would require months, perhaps years of treatment. The first thing was to attend to the physical wounds. The infected ankle was cleaned and bandaged. He was provided with light food, although at first he rejected almost everything. He had to be kept in a room with the curtains closed to protect his eyes from light. But the wounds of the body, however serious they were, paled compared to the wounds of the soul. Tomás didn't speak. He spent entire days sitting in a corner of the room where they had lodged him, in the same position he had maintained for a decade, hunched over, with knees against his chest, gaze lost in nothingness. At night he screamed, terrible screams that woke the entire doctor's household, nightmares from which he woke trembling, searching with his hands for the chain that was no longer there. He developed strange behaviors. He constantly measured spaces with his steps, as if he were still limited by the 2 meters of chain. He refused to sleep in a bed. He could only do so on the floor. He ate with his hands directly from the plate, without using utensils because he had forgotten how to use them. Father Medina tried to help spiritually. He came to visit every week. He spoke to him about God and forgiveness. But Tomás didn't respond. One afternoon, the priest was reading aloud a passage from the Gospels when Tomás spoke for the first time in weeks. His voice was barely a hoarse whisper. God didn't come. Those were the first complete words he had pronounced since his liberation. Father Medina fell silent. What could he answer? The public reaction. News of the case spread through Piedras Negras like fire. El Monitor Fronterizo, the local newspaper, published an article on March 28, 1882. Abominable case discovered in our city. A minor has been found in conditions that offend God and civilization. Don Esteban Carranza, tanner by profession and until now considered an honorable man of our community, has been arrested for keeping his wife's stepson in prolonged captivity for a period of nearly 10 years. The minor, whose name we protect out of respect for his dignity, was found chained in a windowless room, in a state of severe malnutrition and with physical and mental damages that could be irreversible. Dr. German Villarreal, who was attending to the minor, declared to this newspaper that never in his medical practice had he witnessed a case of cruelty so systematic and prolonged. The authorities are investigating whether the minor's mother, Dona Maria Soto, should also face charges of complicity for not reporting these events for a decade. This newspaper calls upon the authorities so that this case does not go unpunished and serves as a warning that no paternal right justifies the torment of a child. The community's reaction was divided. Some, especially women, expressed horror and demanded exemplary punishment. But others, particularly some men from the older generations, defended Esteban. A father has the right to discipline his children as he sees fit, they argued in the cantinas. Now it turns out the government sticks its nose into how one raises the kids. This division reflected the clash between two worlds, the old order where paternal authority was absolute and unquestionable, and the new ideas about the rights of minors that were just beginning to germinate in Mexico. Maria's torment. Maria Soto faced her own hell. She wasn't arrested, but the social judgment was implacable. The neighbor women pointed at her on the street. Unnatural mother, they shouted at her. How could you allow that to happen to your own son? She had no answer. Or perhaps the answer was too complex for those minds that judged without understanding. Fear, economic dependence, a society that gave her no options, authorities that would have ignored her complaints, a church that ordered her to obey her husband. She tried to commit suicide 2 weeks after Tomás's liberation. Isabel found her in time in her room with a rope. She was briefly hospitalized with Dr. Villarreal, who diagnosed profound melancholy with self-destructive tendencies. The trial of Esteban Carranza began on May 15, 1882. District Judge Don Rodrigo Fernandez presided. He was a man known for his strict adherence to the law, but also for a certain moral sensitivity unusual for his time. The formal accusation was cruel and degrading treatment of a minor under his guardianship, with aggravating circumstances due to the prolongation of the mistreatment and the permanent physical and mental consequences. Esteban hired a defense attorney, Licenciado Anselmo Gutierrez, who presented the expected defense. The father has the right to correct his children. The accused was acting within his parental authority rights. The minor showed problematic behaviors that required severe discipline. But Dr. Villarreal's testimony was devastating for the defense. "In my 25 years as a doctor," he declared before the tribunal, "I have seen victims of terrible accidents, of cruel diseases, of extreme violence. But never had I seen suffering so systematic, so prolonged, so calculated. That boy was not punished. He was tortured for a decade by the man who should have protected him. The consequences of 10 years chained in the darkness are irreversible. His growth is permanently affected. His speech capacity is severely damaged. His mind may never fully recover." The doctor paused, his eyes filling with tears. "And the worst, Your Honor, the worst is that this boy no longer knows what it is to be human. He has forgotten laughter, he has forgotten play, he has forgotten that there exists a world beyond 2 meters of chain. That is not correction. That is destruction of the soul." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Rafael Ochoa also testified, narrating how Esteban had proudly admitted what he was doing. Sheriff Torres described the state of the room and the inhuman conditions in which they found Tomás. Father Medina, although initially reluctant to testify against a parishioner, finally declared that this exceeded any reasonable interpretation of Christian discipline. Maria was called to testify. She arrived dressed in black, emaciated, with the look of someone who has already died inside. "Why didn't you report these events?" asked the prosecutor. "Because I was afraid," she responded with a barely audible voice. "Because I depended on him. Because every time I tried to speak he hit me. Why? Because I'm a coward and I'll live with that for the rest of my life." "Did you try to seek help at any time?" "I spoke with Father Medina in confession. He told me to obey my husband." Father Medina, sitting among the public, lowered his head. Tomás's words. The most disturbing moment of the trial came when they tried to have Tomás testify. The judge decided that the boy didn't have to be physically present in the courtroom, but he wanted to hear his version somehow. Dr. Villarreal had been working with Tomás, trying to rebuild his communication capacity. With much patience, he had managed to get the boy to write some simple words. On May 25th, the doctor presented a wrinkled paper before the tribunal. On it, with a trembling and childish handwriting, were written 5 words. "I just wanted him to love me." Judge Fernandez had to pause the session. Several of those present were crying openly. Esteban Carranza was the last to testify. He climbed to the stand with his head held high. "I don't regret anything," he said. "I did what I had to do. That boy came to my house with a rebellious spirit, with a look that showed dark influences. It was my duty, as a man of God and head of the family, to expel those influences. If I had to do it again, I would do exactly the same." His words caused murmurs of indignation in the courtroom. The judge had to call for order. The sentence. The sentence was handed down on June 2, 1882. Judge Fernandez read it with a firm voice. "In the case of the people of Piedras Negras against Esteban Carranza for the crime of severe and prolonged mistreatment of a minor, this court finds the accused guilty of all charges. The evidence presented demonstrates, beyond doubt, that the accused kept a 6-year-old child in conditions of captivity for approximately 10 years, causing physical, psychological, and developmental damage that medical testimony qualifies as permanent and irreversible. While the law recognizes the right of parents to correct their children, no reasonable interpretation of said right can extend to what has been perpetrated here. The accused has not only caused physical harm, he has systematically destroyed the childhood, health, and potentially the future of a defenseless human being. Therefore, this court sentences Esteban Carranza to 20 years in prison to be served in the state penitentiary. Furthermore, he is prohibited for life from any contact with the minor or any member of the family. The seizure of his assets is ordered to cover the medical and maintenance expenses of the minor until he comes of age. 20 years was an unusually long sentence for that era. It was a clear signal that something was changing in Mexican society. Esteban Carranza was transferred to Saltillo prison. Records show he maintained his attitude of moral righteousness for years. He never expressed remorse. In 1901, after serving 19 years of his sentence, he died of pneumonia in his cell. He was 74 years old. His last words, according to the prison chaplain, were, "God knows I did the right thing." The long road to recovery. What became of Tomás? Did he ever recover? Could he rebuild even a part of what was taken from him? And how many other children in that Mexico, in those houses closed by silence and fear, suffered similar torments without anyone knowing? Tomás's story doesn't end with the trial. In fact, it has barely begun. Tomás's recovery was slow, painful, and in many aspects incomplete. Dr. Villarreal took charge of the boy during the first months. His wife, Dona Carmen, a woman with no children of her own, developed a maternal affection for that destroyed young man. The first advances were small but significant. Approximately 1 month after his liberation, Tomás began to walk distances greater than 2 meters. At first he did it with fear, constantly looking back, as if expecting something to stop him. 2 months later, he began to tolerate soft light in the room where he slept. He no longer screamed when he saw a lit candle. At 3 months, he pronounced his first complete sentence without stuttering. "Can I go out to the patio?" Dona Carmen cried with joy. But other problems persisted and manifested in painful ways. Tomás developed an extreme aversion to closed spaces. He couldn't remain in a room with the door closed without panicking. The nightmares continued almost every night. He woke screaming, searching for the chain that was no longer there, convinced that everything had been a dream and that he was still chained in that room. The complex family relationships. His relationship with Maria was complex. He did visit her, but there was a distance that couldn't be crossed. Tomás didn't consciously blame his mother, but something inside him kept the memory that she had known where he was for 10 years and hadn't been able to get him out. Maria, consumed by guilt, tried to compensate for the impossible to compensate. She brought him candy, new clothes, told him stories. But Tomás listened to her with distant politeness, as if he were listening to a stranger. Isabel was the one who achieved the greatest connection with her brother. She also carried guilt, but of a different type. She had been a powerless child before a violent adult. She spent hours with Tomás trying to rebuild what they had been as siblings before hell. She taught him to read again because he had forgotten the few letters he knew. She spoke to him about his biological father, about how he was a good man who had loved him very much in the few months he lived. Education and growth. By the end of 1883, a year and a half after his liberation, Tomás had recovered part of his ability to speak, although the stutter remained. He had gained some weight, now weighing 35 kilograms, but his height remained at 1.48 meters. Doctors confirmed that his growth had permanently stopped. At that time, a rural teacher named Ignacio Rivas, moved by Tomás's story, offered to educate him without charge. The first lessons were difficult. A 15-year-old adolescent sitting on a bench next to 8- and 9-year-old children. Tomás couldn't concentrate. The other children looked at him with curiosity and sometimes with cruelty. "The chain boy," they called him. But teacher Rivas was patient. He taught him in private sessions. Tomás showed a surprisingly good memory for numbers. He could do complex additions and subtractions in his head. Perhaps, speculated the teacher, during all those years in the darkness, counting had been his only way to maintain sanity. counting the days, the hours, the beats of his heart. A new home. In 1884, 2 years after his liberation, an important decision was made about Tomás's future. Dr. Villarreal and his wife wanted to officially adopt him, but Maria opposed. "I already lost 10 years with him," she said with a broken voice. "I'm not going to lose him legally too." Finally, they reached an agreement. Maria would maintain legal parental authority, but Tomás would live with Dr. Villarreal and his wife. It was in the Villarreal's house where Tomás began to show a particular interest. The doctor had a small but well-stocked library. Tomás, once he learned to read fluently, devoured books. He read about distant countries, about oceans he had never seen, about adventures of people who traveled freely through the world. It was as if each book returned to him a piece of the life that had been stolen from him. In the pages he found the freedom that his body still didn't know how to fully inhabit. First job and first love. At 18 years old, in 1886, Tomás got his first job. It was a modest position in Don Andrés Salazar's grocery store, who hired him more out of charity than necessity. The first weeks were anguishing. Tomás panicked when he had to go to the warehouse, a small space without windows. Don Andrés, informed of his story, was understanding and assigned him tasks that didn't require entering closed spaces. Tomás became expert at doing accounts. His ability with numbers proved invaluable. He kept inventory control mentally, without needing to write anything. One day in 1887, a 17-year-old girl named Lucia Mendoza entered the store. She was Don Andrés's niece, visiting from Monclova. Tomás attended to her with his usual shyness. Lucia noticed his stutter and his short stature, but also something more. A deep sadness in his eyes that awakened her curiosity and compassion. She returned to the store several times during her 2-week visit. She talked with Tomás, made him laugh, something that rarely happened. When she had to return to Monclova, they began to exchange letters. Tomás's letters were short at first, shy, full of crossed-out words. But with time they became longer. He told her about the books he read, about the sky he had finally learned to look at without his eyes hurting, about his desire to someday travel beyond Piedras Negras. Lucia responded with stories of her own life, with descriptions of the Monclova landscape, with words of encouragement. "Don't let your past define your entire future," she wrote in one of her letters. "You are more than what they did to you." Those words touched something deep in Tomás. Journey to Monclova. In 1888, after a year of correspondence, Tomás traveled to Monclova to visit Lucia. It was the first time he had left Piedras Negras since his liberation. The train trip terrified him. The closed cars caused him panic attacks. He had to stay on the platform between cars, where at least there was air and he could see the sky. But when he arrived in Monclova and saw Lucia waiting for him at the station, something in his chest expanded. Perhaps it was what others called hope. Lucia introduced him to her family. She hadn't told them the details of Tomás's story, only that he was a hard-working young man who had suffered a lot. Lucia's father, Don Esteban Mendoza, cruel coincidence of names, was a shoemaker. He offered Tomás to stay a few days and put him to work in the workshop. Tomás discovered he had skill for leather work. His hands, though small, were precise. The repetition of manual work was almost therapeutic for him. 2 weeks later, when it was time to return to Piedras Negras, Tomás took Lucia's hand. It was the first time he had voluntarily touched another human being since his liberation. Can I come back?" he asked. "Always," she responded. Courtship and marriage. During the following months, Tomás traveled every 2 weeks to Monclova. He worked with Don Esteban during the day, walked with Lucia in the afternoons. She taught him to dance, although he was always clumsy at dancing, and he read her passages from the books he loved. In December 1889, Tomás asked Lucia's father for permission to formally court her. Don Esteban accepted, though with reservations. He knew there was something in that young man's past, something dark he didn't dare to ask about. The wedding was celebrated on February 14, 1890. Tomás was 22 years old, Lucia 20. It was a simple ceremony in Monclova with few guests. Maria attended, sitting at the back of the church, crying silently. Isabel was next to her brother as witness. Dr. Villarreal and Dona Carmen were also present, proud of the young man in whom they had seen a miracle of will and survival. During the ceremony, when the priest asked if anyone opposed the union, there was a tense silence. Tomás looked toward the door as if expecting Esteban Carranza to appear to reclaim him. But the door remained closed. The monster of his childhood was in prison hundreds of kilometers away. Married life. Tomás and Lucia settled in Monclova. They rented a small two-room house on Juarez Street. Tomás worked with his father-in-law in the shoe shop and Lucia sewed clothes for some families in town. The first months of marriage were a mixture of happiness and pain. Lucia discovered the depth of her husband's psychological damage. Tomás couldn't sleep with the bedroom door closed. The nightmares continued. Sometimes he woke up screaming, confused, not knowing where he was. There were nights when Lucia found him sitting in a corner of the room, huddled with a lost look. "I'm here," she would tell him softly. "You're safe. No one is going to hurt you." And slowly, very slowly, Tomás would return to the present. Fatherhood, breaking the cycle. In 1891, their first daughter was born. They named her Carmen in honor of Dona Carmen Villarreal. When Tomás held his daughter for the first time, something broke and rebuilt inside him at the same time. He cried. He cried like he hadn't cried since he was a 6-year-old boy locked in the darkness. But this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of something he had forgotten: love, hope, future. "Never," he whispered while rocking Carmen. "Never will you lack my love. Never will you know darkness." And he kept that promise. Tomás and Lucia had 3 more children, Juan in 1893, Rosa in 1895, and Miguel in 1898. Tomás was a present father, affectionate, attentive, perhaps overly protective, but never violent. He read to them every night before bed. He taught them mathematics and how to read. He played with them in the house's patio. His children grew up knowing their father was different, that he had strange fears, that sometimes he stared into infinity with inexplicable sadness. But they also knew he was a man who loved them with an intensity that bordered on desperate. Tomás never told them the complete details of what he had lived through. He only said, "My childhood was difficult." It wasn't until Carmen, his eldest daughter, was 15 that she asked him directly, "Dad, why are you so short? Why do you stutter? Why do you have those scars on your ankle?" Tomás, who was then 37 years old, was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because when I was your age, I was still chained in a dark room, and I spent 10 years there." He said no more, but it was enough for Carmen to understand. The passing years. The years passed. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. Mexico lived through the revolution with all its promises and tragedies. Tomás and his family survived those turbulent years. The shoe shop prospered modestly. Tomás never returned to Piedras Negras. He couldn't. Just thinking about returning to that house on Commerce Street caused him anxiety attacks so severe they left him bedridden for days. Maria died in 1912, at 67 years old. Isabel wrote Tomás a letter to inform him. Tomás read the letter in silence, then folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. He didn't cry. He simply said, "Rest in peace, Mom." He never knew if he had forgiven her. Perhaps it wasn't a question of forgiveness. It was something more complex, something that had no words. Isabel moved to Monclova after her mother's death. She spent her last years near her brother, helping Lucia with the grandchildren when they arrived. Siblings who had survived the same hell, each carrying their own version of the trauma, found comfort in silent closeness. The journalist's visit. In 1926, a young journalist from Mexico City named Alberto Mendoza, unrelated to Lucia's family, was researching historical cases of child abuse for an article about changes in laws protecting minors. He found references to the Piedras Negras case in old judicial archives. It fascinated and terrified him in equal parts. He managed to track Tomás to Monclova. He appeared one day at the shoe shop, where Tomás, now 58 years old, was still working. "Don Tomás Ramírez?" he asked. Tomás looked up from the shoe he was repairing. His hands trembled slightly. No one used his full surname. Who's asking? The journalist explained his purpose. He wanted to write about the case. He wanted the story not to be forgotten. He wanted it to serve to change things. Tomás listened in silence. Then he shook his head. That was a long time ago. Leave it buried. But, Don Tomás, insisted the journalist, your story could help other children. My story, responded Tomás with a tired voice, is mine, and it cost me too much to build a life after it to stir it up now. Please, leave. The journalist respected his decision. He never published the article. The final years. Tomás Ramírez died on August 16, 1933. He was 65 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him knew that his heart had been broken since he was 6 years old, and it simply took 59 more years to stop completely. He was buried in the municipal cemetery of Monclova. His tombstone, paid for by his children, carries a simple inscription. Tomás Ramírez Soto, 1868 to 1933. Beloved father, devoted, survived the darkness, lived in the light. His 4 children, now adults, cried at his funeral. Carmen, the eldest, read a poem she herself had written. We never knew all your pain, but we always knew all your love. And that, Dad, is what we will remember. Lucia survived Tomás by 16 years. She died in 1949 at 79 years old. She never remarried. There can only be one love like the one I had, she would say. And that's enough for me for 2 lifetimes. The house of horror. But what about the place? What happened to that cursed house on Commerce Street? And how many other similar cases remained hidden in the archives of time? The house on Commerce Street number 32 in Piedras Negras had a fate in keeping with its history. After Esteban's arrest, the judge ordered the seizure of the property. It was put up for sale, but no one bought it. The rumors about what had happened there scared away any possible buyer. The house of the chained boy, they called it. For years it remained abandoned. The windows broke. The door rotted. The townspeople began to avoid passing by that street after sunset. They said they heard noises, chains dragging, a child's crying. It was probably the wind playing with the remains of rusted metal that remained in the back room. Or perhaps it was the collective guilt of a community that had remained silent for 10 years, manifesting itself in the form of superstition. In 1905, 23 years after the case, the house was finally demolished. The workers who tore down the walls reported something disturbing. In the back room, in the dirt floor where the pillar had been driven, they found marks, concentric circles worn in the earth. It was where Tomás's feet had walked in circles for years, limited by the length of his chain, unknowingly tracing the map of his prison. One of the workers, a man of about 30 named Federico Rios, stood looking at those marks for a long time. Then he said to his companions, "Let's bury them deep, so no one else sees them. There are things that are better not to endure." They filled the space with new earth and rubble. A small hardware store was later built on that land. Today, more than 100 years later, there's a clothing store. The current owners don't know what existed there. The young people of Piedras Negras don't know either. The story was buried like so many others. Other cases, the pattern of horror. But the case of Tomás Ramírez was not unique. In 1938, a regional historian named Ernesto Valdez, while researching 19th century judicial archives in Coahuila, found references to other similar cases. Saltillo, 1871. An 11-year-old girl discovered after living locked in a basement for 5 years. The case never went to trial. The father was an influential merchant. Paris de la Fuente, 1863. A wealthy family kept 3 children of their workers, in conditions of slavery. When discovered, the children had forgotten their own names. Monclova, 1892. Ironically, in the same city where Tomás would build his life, a teenager was found who had been kept in a barn for 7 years, also in chains, also for his own good. The details varied, but the pattern was the same. Adults who justified extreme cruelty under the mantle of paternal correction, communities that looked the other way, authorities that intervened too late or never. Valdez estimated that in Coahuila alone, during the 19th century, there were at least 20 documented cases of severe and prolonged abuse of minors. But documented doesn't mean reported. And reported doesn't mean investigated. And investigated doesn't mean punished. How many cases were never documented? How many children died in silence? How many survived but never spoke? The system that enabled horror. The system that allowed the horror Tomás lived was systemic. It wasn't the product of a monstrous individual, although Esteban Carranza was one, but of a complete social structure, absolute parental authority, the invisibility of children in legislation, the idea that minors were property of their parents, the normalization of corporal punishment, the lack of reporting mechanisms, the isolation of families, the stigma against women who left abusive marriages. All this created the perfect environment for these horrors to occur. Small changes, slow progress. Tomás's case did generate some changes, though slow and limited. In 1884, 2 years after the trial, the state of Coahuila modified its civil code to specify clearer limits to parental authority. It was established that physical punishment could not leave permanent marks or affect the normal development of the minor. It was a small advance, but it was something. In 1893, the first Child Protection Society in northern Mexico was created in Piedras Negras. It was founded precisely by Rafael Ochoa, the young worker who had reported Tomás's case. Rafael never forgave himself for not having acted earlier, although he had known about the situation only one day before reporting it. The society he founded had as its main objective to create a network of community vigilance. They promoted that neighbors report suspicious situations. They offered temporary refuge to children at risk. It was a small effort with limited resources, but it saved lives. Rafael Ochoa died in 1921. Until his last days, he visited schools and spoke about the importance of protecting minors. It cannot be that society is less sensitive to the suffering of a child than to the theft of a cow, he would say. The Lost Memorial. In 1946, 64 years after the case, a retired teacher from Piedras Negras named Esperanza Torres, granddaughter of the sheriff who had participated in Tomás's rescue, proposed the placement of a commemorative plaque. There was resistance. Why remember something so terrible? Some argued. It's better to forget. But Esperanza insisted. To forget is to betray. To forget is to allow it to happen again. To remember is the first form of prevention. The plaque was finally placed in 1948 on a wall of the municipal palace of Piedras Negras. It said, "In memory of all the children who suffered in silence, in honor of those who had the courage to break that silence. Never again." It didn't mention specific names, didn't tell details of the case, was deliberately vague. But for those who knew the story, the message was clear. That plaque was there for decades. Then, sometime in the 1980s, during a remodeling of the building, it disappeared. No one knows what happened to it. Perhaps it was discarded by accident. Perhaps someone decided it was better to forget. Today, the questions that remain. Today, in the 21st century, the case of Tomás Ramírez is known only by some local historians and a few descendants of the families involved. The complete judicial archives are preserved in the Historical Archive of the State of Coahuila in Saltillo. They occupy 3 thick files. Few people consult them. In 2017, a psychology student from the Autonomous University of Coahuila found them while researching for her thesis on childhood trauma. She read Dr. Villarreal's testimony and cried in the archive's reading room. "It's from the 19th century," she wrote in her thesis. "But it could be from yesterday. The mechanisms of abuse haven't changed that much. What has changed, hopefully, is our willingness to see it and act. But has it really changed?" The case of Tomás Ramírez poses uncomfortable questions. How many children right now are living in situations of systematic abuse? How many neighbors hear and look the other way? How many times does respect for family privacy become complicity with horror? Legal mechanisms have improved. Yes, child protection institutions now exist. There are hotlines for anonymous reports. Laws recognize minors as subjects of rights. But the human patterns that allowed what happened to Tomás — silence, fear, denial, justification of extreme punishment, still exist. Every year in Mexico, thousands of cases of child abuse are reported, and those are only the reported ones. How many more remain hidden behind closed doors? The double legacy. The legacy of Tomás Ramírez's case is twofold. On one hand, it's a reminder of the abyss of cruelty that human beings can reach, especially when cruelty disguises itself as moral righteousness. On the other hand, it's a testimony of resilience. Tomás survived not just physically. He built a life. He loved and was loved. He broke the cycle of violence that he could have perpetuated. His children never knew abuse. His grandchildren grew up in homes full of love. The horror he lived was not transmitted. That is perhaps the true triumph. The victor. Tomás Ramírez Soto was not just a victim. He was a survivor and, ultimately, a victor. Because every day he lived after those 10 years, every moment of love he gave his children, every smile he managed to sketch despite the pain, it was a victory against the darkness that tried to devour him. Thank you for accompanying us on this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Coahuila. If the story has impacted you, share it, because remembering is the first form of prevention. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and leave us in the comments your reflection on this case. How do you think we can, as a society, detect and prevent similar situations? What responsibility do we have as neighbors, as community, when we suspect a child is in danger? We'll read you in the next story. Until soon. In memory of Tomás Ramírez Soto, 1868 to 1933, and all the children who suffered in silence. And in honor of those who had the courage to break that silence. Never again. If you found value in this narration, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you.